Hello, this is Lisa, Associate Director of the Law Library and Reference Librarian. In this video, we will discuss tips and suggestions for effective prompting when using generative AI for legal research. First, let's define our terms. What is prompting and why do you care? Prompting is essentially figuring out what it is you need to research, what's your legal question, and then figuring out how to ask that question. Now, of course, you've been doing this when you search traditional Lexis and Westlaw or even Google. What makes it so different and why should we be talking about it with generative AI? The quality of what you ask the AI will make a big difference in the quality of the answer the AI gives you. So what are some basic guidelines for creating effective prompts? Try different prompts. Phrasing a question differently may provide a better response or may clarify an issue you don't yet clearly understand. Trying different prompts and experimenting is really a theme of this video. Another good guideline to keep in mind is to provide overall context. Write a clear, concise, and focused query. Here are some aspects to keep in mind in order to do that. If you know any of these, your practice area, cause of action, etc. Keep in mind when using a legal AI that your strategy may be different than what you may be used to if you use a more general AI like ChatGPT. Okay, these are pretty general guidelines. What do they mean in practice? So first, advice on trying different prompt styles. Here are a couple of examples. You can describe a situation with the facts and issue, kind of like when you see a hypothetical, or you can ask a direct legal question. Typically, but not always, asking the direct question will be a better strategy. You might try that first, but describing the situation can sometimes be effective as well. You can try both more specific, detailed prompts, and then you can try a different, broader prompt, which is with a more general question. Again, experiment, see what works best. Experiment also with an explicit direction to find cases or other primary source types like statutes or regulations, and then try a different prompt without that explicit direction to find cases. Let's see an example of that on Westlaw's AI platform. Here I am in regular Westlaw. I'm going to use the AI Assisted Research tab. That's part of Westlaw's CoCounsel AI platform. You can also try that as well. And here is where I would enter my question. You'll notice I've limited the jurisdiction here in the filter. Here you will see the results of a direct question to the AI. Does the ADA require an employer to reassign an employee to a vacant position as a reasonable accommodation? And the results from our direct question is a pretty straightforward answer. The ADA does not require an employer to reassign, and then it gives a little bit of explanation, and then some qualifications and some citations to cases. An alternative approach is to try to add an explicit request to find and summarize the best cases that discuss whether the ADA requires an employee to reassign an employee. And here you see slightly different results. You see a briefer explanation about what the ADA requires, and then you see a numbered list of some of the aspects of the issue that you would want to consider. So asking explicitly to find cases gives us slightly different results. Whatever prompt style you use, you want to make sure to include the legal context and material facts. What this means is that if you know it, you want to refer to the legal standard, and if you know what the material facts are, you want to make sure to include them as well as your specific question. So here's an example of a prompt or a query that's pretty basic. What are the defenses to a securities fraud claim? There's no specific reference to a standard or particular facts. Here is a better prompt or query which provides you the specific legal standard, the Securities Exchange Act, the specific rule, 10b-5, and then goes on to also include the material facts about false representations regarding earnings, as well as the company claiming it did not know the statement was false or misleading. So in the circumstances where you do know the legal standard, the Securities Exchange Act in this example, or the material facts, make sure to include them in your prompt or query. Also, when thinking about the legal context and material facts, make sure to avoid non-material facts. Do not include anything extraneous. Each term should be essential. Here's an example of a query with lots of non-material facts. It's talking about the sustaining a back injury and lifting patients and other heavy objects. Lots of extraneous information here. A better query would be the more targeted focus. Does the ADA require an employer to reassign an employee to a vacant position as a reasonable accommodation? Note, a shorter query can sometimes be a better one. Sometimes a longer query is going to be a better one, again, if you are including the relevant standards and material facts. You want to include your jurisdiction when it's appropriate. You can specify the jurisdiction either in the text of your prompt, or you can use the AI filter that you will see on the various systems where available. You want to focus on a single issue or question, and then you use a follow-up prompt for additional question. So for example, here is a prompt that contains a couple of different questions. Our ADA question requiring an employer to reassign employee, and whether has the employee satisfied their requirement for providing notice. A better, more effective way to run this query is to first run the query, does the ADA require an employer to reassign the employee? And then after you get your AI results, ask your follow-up query, does an employee's request to be reassigned to a vacant position constitute providing notice? Of course, you want to avoid including proper names, but also avoid using the litigation role. You want to use the party's role in the issues, so for example, employer or employee in our ADA example, rather than their role in the litigation, plaintiff or defendant. Here's a different prompt with a different example where in this example you don't want to use the word plaintiff. Instead, the better prompt or query, you want to use the role in the issue, employer, primary beneficiary, intern, and employee. I've talked about the usefulness of using follow-up prompts. You want to experiment with different types of follow-up prompts. So you can use follow-up prompts to clarify or ask additional questions. So here's a different issue. In New York, can paternal grandparents obtain visitation rights for their grandchild when the father has ceased to utilize his visitation rights and the mother objects? Note, we know some of the material facts here and have included that in the query. In the course, in your answer from the AI, you may learn some follow-up issues. So here's an example of a good follow-up query. How does the court evaluate best interests of the child in visitation cases? So you may have learned best interest is an important aspect of this issue, and you can use it in a follow-up query. Another type of follow-up prompt you might want to try is called a meta prompt. Here are a couple of examples of meta prompts. You're basically asking the AI to help you. One I particularly like is ask me what other information you might need to answer this question. So in this query, the same issue as just before. In New York, when can grandparents sue for visitation rights to their grandchildren? Here I might not know. This is an example where I don't know what the material facts are. I don't know what the standard is. So it's a very basic question. Knowing that I don't know much about the issue, I may want to run this query and then run a follow-up query or prompt, ask me what other information you might need to answer this question. I'll show you an example of this using Lexis's AI. Here on Lexis, we are looking at Lexis AI called Protege, and here's where I would want to ask a legal question. So in looking at how Lexis would handle our question, in New York, when can grandparents sue for visitation rights to their grandchildren? We see the basic answer, can sue for visitation rights. We see the reference to the applicable statute, and the AI gives us some basic information about that and starts to talk about the cases interpreting that statute. Of course, you want to check out those cases and look at the Lexis related material, which can give you some other background for your issue. And here we see the results for our follow-up prompt, our meta prompt. Ask me what other information you might need to answer this question. And here the AI provides us with a bulleted list of some of the aspects we may want to consider. Clarification of equitable circumstances, factors for determining best interest. So the AI has highlighted for us that best interest is important if we didn't know that. Impact of parental objections. So we now know parental objections is an important material fact. On Lexis, if you go to the end of your results, you will also see some suggested follow-up questions. These can be really useful in highlighting aspects you may not know about or giving you help on phrasing a particular prompt. So to summarize, experiment, the theme of this video. Try lots of different prompts and experiment, but always make sure to evaluate each and every prompt. Here are examples of what we discussed and techniques to try: a broad basic question versus very specific questions with more details, meta prompts, instructions versus questions, so instructions to find cases as opposed to just a direct legal question. Include legal context and material facts when you know them, and avoid those non-material facts. Use follow-up prompts for additional questions. Take advantage of suggested prompts where available. Remember, generative AI is changing so fast. What works or doesn't work today may change tomorrow. Here are resources for additional information. To view these slides, go to where you found the link for this video. Good luck!